The machine rejected my card 3 times while everyone in line watched. Richard stood behind me, arms crossed, shaking his head like I was a child who couldn't handle basic adult responsibilities. When I turned to him for help, he simply walked away, leaving me there with a cart full of groceries and tears burning my eyes. 5 years later, he walked into my bank begging for a loan. The look on his face when the manager called me President Bradford was worth every sleepless night I'd endured to get there. You own the bank now, he whispered, his voice barely audible as the color drained from his face. Bradford Financial acquired First Liberty 3 weeks ago, I replied calmly, opening his loan application. Please, have a seat, Mr. Sullivan. Sometimes, life gives you the perfect opportunity to show someone exactly what they lost. If this story resonates with you, make sure to like and subscribe. Tomorrow, I've saved something extra special just for you. Another tale of sweet justice you won't want to miss. The fluorescent lights of First Liberty Bank cast everything in harsh, unforgiving white as I stood at the teller window, my hands trembling slightly as I slid the withdrawal slip across the marble counter. $300. That's all I needed to cover the final payment for Mom's physical therapy sessions. Margaret Wilson, the nameplate read as the teller examined my request with growing concern. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but this account shows insufficient funds, she said, her voice carefully modulated to avoid drawing attention from other customers. There's only $40.70.18 available. My stomach dropped. That was impossible. I managed our household finances meticulously, tracking every expense in color-coded spreadsheets that Richard constantly mocked as obsessive. I knew exactly how much should be in that account. Could you check again? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. There should be over $2,000. The teller's fingers clicked across her keyboard, her expression growing more sympathetic with each passing second. I show a large withdrawal made yesterday evening, $500 taken from the ATM on Beacon Street. Beacon Street? 3 blocks from Jessica's apartment. My chest tightened as the pieces clicked into place. Richard had been working late again, or so he claimed, those mysterious overtime hours that never seemed to appear on his pay stubs. Ma'am, is everything all right? The teller's voice seemed to come from underwater. Would you like me to print your recent transaction history? I nodded numbly, accepting the paper with hands that no longer felt like my own. There it was in black and white, withdrawal after withdrawal, all from locations I never visited, all on days when Richard claimed to be putting in extra hours at Sullivan Construction. The pattern stretched back months. The elderly man behind me cleared his throat impatiently, and I stepped aside, clutching the evidence of my husband's betrayal. I felt Richard's eyes on me from across the bank lobby, where he'd been watching the entire humiliating exchange, his arms crossed, an expression of contempt barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of concern. When I approached him, transaction history in hand, he shook his head like I was a child who couldn't handle basic adult responsibilities. I told you to deposit my check yesterday, he said, loud enough for others to hear. Did you forget again? Your check was deposited, I said quietly, but there were withdrawals, large ones, from Beacon Street. Something flickered across his face, annoyance, not guilt. We'll talk about this at home, he said dismissively. Put back the groceries. We obviously can't afford them right now. I need to pay Mom's physical therapist, I said, my voice smaller than I intended. She's waiting for me right now. Richard sighed dramatically. Margaret, I can't solve every problem. Maybe your mother should start covering some of her own expenses. He turned and walked toward the exit, expecting me to follow like I always did. I stood there, cart full of groceries, transaction history in hand, tears burning behind my eyes but refusing to fall. 15 years of marriage, and this was what it had come to: public humiliation and casual cruelty. Through the glass doors, I watched Richard climb into his Range Rover and drive away, leaving me stranded. The bank manager approached, an older woman with kind eyes. Mrs. Wilson, is there something we can help you with today, 5 years later? I would remember that moment standing abandoned in First Liberty Bank as the turning point of my life. Outside the bank, I sat in my aging Honda Civic, staring at the transaction list until the numbers blurred together. 15 years of marriage, 15 years of trusting Richard with our finances, while I focused on my part-time bookkeeping work and caring for my mother. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Working late again. Don't wait up. Working late? I almost laughed at the audacity of it. I started the car and drove aimlessly through Boston's tree-lined streets, past the coffee shops where we used to spend lazy Sunday mornings, past the park where he proposed on one knee beside the duck pond. Everything looked the same, but I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time. through eyes that finally understood how naive I'd been when I pulled into our driveway 2 hours later. Richard's truck was already there. The living room glowed with the blue light of the television, and I could hear him laughing at some comedy special. The sound grated against my raw nerves. "Hey, babe," he called without looking away from the screen as I walked in. "Did you sort out whatever was going on at the bank?" I sat down beside him, the transaction history folded in my pocket like a loaded weapon. "Actually, there was a problem. They said we don't have enough money to cover Mom's payment." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's impossible. I just deposited my paycheck on Friday." The teller showed me our balance, $47. "Richard, where did the money go?" He finally turned to look at me, his brown eyes filled with what I now recognized as practiced innocence. "I don't know. Margaret, maybe there's some kind of bank error. You know how these things get mixed up sometimes." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I almost believed him. Almost. This was the man who'd held me when I cried after my father's funeral, who'd painted our bedroom blue because he knew it was my favorite color, who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health. The same man who was now looking me straight in the eye and lying about stealing our savings. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "I'll call them in the morning." Relief flickered across his features. "Good idea. I'm sure they'll figure it out." That night, I lay awake listening to Richard's steady breathing, planning my next move. I knew I couldn't confront him directly. Not yet. I needed more information, more proof. Most importantly, I needed to understand how deep this betrayal went. The next morning, I waited until Richard left for work before driving back to First Liberty. I requested a complete transaction history for the past year, watching as months of deception printed out in neat chronological order. The pattern was clear and devastating every few weeks. Substantial withdrawals from locations across the city, restaurants I'd never been to, hotels I couldn't afford, shopping centers where Richard claimed to hate going, armed with addresses. I spent the day playing detective, the Italian restaurant on Newberry Street, where Richard had supposedly never eaten, confirmed that yes, he was a regular customer, always with the same woman, a blonde who drove a red convertible. The hotel on the waterfront had seen them monthly for the past 8 months. The jewelry store clerk remembered them picking out matching bracelets just last week. By evening, I had a complete picture of my husband's double life. Richard Wilson, devoted husband and hardworking construction foreman, was actually Richard Wilson, serial cheater and financial manipulator. He'd been systematically draining our accounts to fund his relationship with someone else, leaving me to struggle with basic expenses while he played the generous boyfriend. I drove to Jessica's apartment complex that night, parking across the street with a clear view of her building. I didn't have to wait long. Richard's truck pulled up at 7:30, and I watched him climb the stairs to the second floor, carrying a bottle of wine and what looked like takeout from the expensive sushi place downtown. Through her window, I could see them embracing, laughing, playing house with my money. The woman was younger than me, maybe 28 to my 35, with the kind of effortless beauty that Richard had always claimed didn't matter to him. She worked at the marketing firm where Richard's company had done some renovation work 2 years ago. I remembered him mentioning her name a few times, always casually, always in passing. Jessica this, Jessica that. I'd been so trusting, so secure in our marriage that it never occurred to me to be suspicious. I sat there for 3 hours, watching them move around her apartment like they'd been together for years. When Richard finally emerged at 11, kissing her goodbye at the door, I felt something inside me break and rebuild simultaneously. The Margaret who had driven here was gone. In her place sat someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more determined. The confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than expected, the next afternoon. I was organizing my mother's medications when Richard walked into the kitchen with an expression I'd never seen before, guilt mixed with defiance, like a child caught stealing who was angry at being discovered. "We need to talk," he said, setting his keys on the counter with deliberate care. "About what?" I kept my voice neutral, curious to see how much he was willing to admit. "About us, about our marriage." He ran his hands through his dark hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing. "Margaret, I haven't been happy for a long time." There it was, the classic cheater's playbook. Make it about feelings, about incompatibility, about anything except the conscious choice to betray and steal. "What do you mean?" I asked, still playing innocent. "We've grown apart. You're so focused on your mother, on your little bookkeeping jobs, on everything except us. I feel like I'm married to a stranger." The audacity was breathtaking. I was focused on everything except us, because I was the only one actually maintaining our life, while he played fantasy romance with his girlfriend. "So, what are you saying?" "Richard." I think we should separate. Take some time to figure out what we both want. I nodded slowly, as if considering this revelation. And where would you go during this separation? I've already found a place. Nothing fancy. Just somewhere to clear my head. Jessica's apartment. No doubt. I wondered if she knew she was about to become a rebound housing solution. What about money, our accounts, the house payments, my mother's medical expenses? Richard's discomfort was palpable. We'll figure that out. Maybe you could ask your mother to help with her own bills for a while. My 72-year-old mother, living on Social Security and Medicare, should help with bills that Richard had made impossible to pay by stealing our savings. The suggestion was so cruel, so callous, that I finally understood exactly who I'd married. When were you thinking of moving out? I asked. This weekend. I think it's better if we do this quickly, like removing a bandage, more like abandoning a sinking ship he deliberately sabotaged. That night, after Richard went to bed, I began my own preparations. If he wanted to end our marriage, I wouldn't fight him, but I also wouldn't let him destroy me financially in the process. I spent hours researching divorce laws, asset protection, and my rights as a spouse. I printed everything, storing the documents in a box I hid in my mother's garage. I also began documenting everything, every conversation, every transaction, every lie. I photographed our belongings, recorded the current state of our home, and compiled evidence of Richard's systematic theft of our joint funds. If this was going to get ugly, I wanted to be prepared. Friday afternoon, Richard came home with boxes and a rental truck. He brought his friend Marcus to help, a decent guy who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. You sure about this, man? Marcus asked as they loaded Richard's dresser. Margaret's a good people. It's complicated, Richard replied, not meeting his friend's eyes. I watched from the kitchen window as they packed up 15 years of shared life furniture we'd picked out together. Appliances I'd researched and saved for. Tools Richard had bought with money from our joint account. He was taking whatever he wanted and leaving me with the bills. Margaret, he said, appearing in the doorway as Marcus loaded the last box. I know this is hard, but it's for the best. Is it? I asked. We both deserve to be happy. And you think this will make you happy? Something flickered across his face then, a moment of uncertainty that was quickly suppressed. I think it's our best chance. After they left, I sat in our suddenly cavernous living room, surrounded by the gaps where Richard's belongings used to be. The silence was profound, but not uncomfortable. For the first time in months, I could think clearly, without the constant hum of underlying tension that had become the soundtrack of our marriage. I made a list. 1. Protect what little money remained in our accounts. 2. Find a job that paid enough to cover the mortgage and my mother's expenses. 3. Figure out how to rebuild my life from the ground up. The first item was easier than expected. A quick visit to my lawyer confirmed that I could freeze our joint accounts pending divorce proceedings. Richard's theft was well documented, and the court would likely order him to repay what he'd taken. The second item was more challenging. My part-time bookkeeping clients provided steady but modest income. I needed something bigger, something with growth potential. That's when I remembered my college friend Emily, who worked in finance in Chicago. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and the occasional social media comment. She'd always encouraged me to use my accounting degree for something more ambitious than balancing small business books. I called her that Sunday evening, after spending the weekend alone in my empty house. Margaret, Emily's voice was warm and surprised. What a wonderful surprise. How are you? Actually, not great. I admitted. Richard and I are getting divorced, and I need to make some major changes in my life. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? I gave her the abbreviated version, careful not to dwell on the details that still felt too raw to share. Emily listened without judgment, offering the kind of practical sympathy that reminded me why we've been friends for so long. You know, she said thoughtfully, we just had an opening in our compliance department. It's entry level, but it's with a growing financial company, and there's room for advancement. You'd be perfect for it. In Chicago, sometimes a geographic change is exactly what you need for a fresh start. A fresh start. The phrase resonated in ways I hadn't expected. Boston held too many memories, too many reminders of the life I'd thought I was living. Maybe what I needed wasn't to rebuild in the same place, but to build something entirely new, somewhere else. Tell me more about the job, I said. Emily described Horizon Financial, a forward-thinking institution that specialized in serving small businesses and first-time homebuyers. They were expanding rapidly, implementing new technologies, and looking for detail-oriented people who could grow with the company. The salary isn't huge to start, she warned, but there are bonuses, benefits, and real opportunities for promotion. Plus, Chicago's great. You'd love it here. Love it. I made the decision that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and the silence of my empty house. I would sell everything, take the job in Chicago, and start over completely not running from my problems, but running towards something better. The next month passed in a blur of preparation. I filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and Richard's financial misconduct. My lawyer was optimistic about recovering the stolen funds, though she warned it might take time. I put the house on the market, sold most of our furniture, and arranged for my mother to move in with my sister in nearby Cambridge. Richard appeared sporadically during this process, usually to collect more of his belongings or to argue about asset division. He seemed genuinely shocked that I was planning to leave Boston. "You can't just move to Chicago," he said during one particularly heated conversation. "This is your home." "This was our home," I corrected. "Now it's just a house I can't afford, full of memories I don't want." "What about your mother, your clients? You're throwing away everything you've built here." The irony was staggering. Richard, who had thrown away our marriage for his affair, who had stolen our savings to fund his deception, was lecturing me about making impulsive decisions. "I'm not throwing anything away," I said calmly. "I'm choosing to start fresh somewhere that doesn't remind me of how naive I used to be." Something in my tone must have warned him off, because he didn't argue further. I think he was beginning to realize that the compliant, trusting wife he'd married was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize and couldn't manipulate. The house sold quickly in Boston's hot real estate market, after paying off the mortgage and setting aside funds for Richard's court-ordered debt repayment. I had enough money to make a genuine fresh start, not wealthy, but not destitute either. Enough to rent a small apartment in Chicago and survive until my new job's paycheck started coming in. My last night in Boston, I drove through the city one final time past the bank where I'd discovered Richard's betrayal, past the park where he'd proposed, past all the places where I'd been happy before I knew better. I felt no sadness, only a profound sense of completion. That chapter of my life was closed, and tomorrow I would begin writing a new one. The moving truck pulled away from my house at dawn, carrying the few possessions I decided to keep. My car was packed with clothes, important documents, and my grandmother's jewelry, the only truly valuable things Richard hadn't been able to touch. As I drove west through Massachusetts, watching the sun rise over the horizon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Chicago welcomed me with crisp lake breezes and endless possibilities. My apartment was tiny but clean, with windows that faced east toward Lake Michigan, which I was already beginning to love. Horizon Financial's offices were modern and bustling, filled with the kind of energy that comes from a company on the rise. My first day was overwhelming in the best possible way. Emily had been right about the growth potential. The compliance department was small but crucial, responsible for ensuring that all of the company's innovative practices met federal banking regulations. My background in accounting made the work intuitive, and my attention to detail, the same trait Richard had mocked as obsessive, was exactly what the job required. "You're going to fit right in," said Linda Carter, my supervisor, as she showed me to my desk. "We need people who can see the big picture while managing the small details." Within weeks, I was handling complex regulatory filings and working directly with the executive team. The work was challenging, but satisfying in ways my old bookkeeping jobs had never been. I was using my brain, solving problems, and contributing to something bigger than myself. My colleagues were smart, driven people who treated me as an equal from day one. There was no condescension, no suggestion that I was just filling time until something better came along. For the first time in years, I felt professionally valued. The personal transformation was slower, but just as significant. Chicago forced me to rebuild my social life from scratch, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. I joined a book club, took evening classes in financial analysis, and gradually constructed a circle of friends who knew me only as Margaret Wilson, the competent financial employee, not Margaret Wilson, the woman whose husband had left her for someone younger. 6 months into my new life, I was asked to join a special project team developing new lending protocols for small businesses. The work required late nights and weekend meetings, but I didn't mind. I had energy for the first time in years, and the project was genuinely important. That's how I met James Bradford. James Bradford walked into the conference room like he owned the building, which, as I would later learn, he practically did. Tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair and intense green eyes, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something significant from nothing. He was Horizon Financial's largest private investor and the founder of Bradford Financial Group, a boutique investment firm that specialized in community banking innovations. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced our CEO, Sandra Wells, "I'd like you to meet James Bradford. He'll be consulting with us on the small business lending expansion." James's handshake was firm, his smile genuine but measuring. I'm looking forward to working with your team. Sandra tells me you've put together something special here. Our project leader, David Rivera, launched into his presentation about streamlined approval processes and risk assessment algorithms. I took notes diligently, but found myself studying James's reactions more than the slides. He asked pointed questions that revealed a deep understanding of both the technical and human sides of banking. When David finished, James leaned back in his chair. Impressive work, he said, but I think you're missing something crucial. The algorithms are solid, the processes are efficient. But where's the personal touch community banking succeeds because it serves real people with real stories, not just credit scores and debt to income ratios. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Our entire presentation had focused on automation and efficiency, the very things James was questioning. What would you suggest? Sandra asked. James's gaze swept the room before settling on me. What do you think, Ms. Wilson? You've been taking notes, but I haven't heard your perspective. All eyes turned to me. 6 months ago, I would have deferred to my colleagues, played it safe, avoided drawing attention, but that woman had been left behind in Boston, along with everything else from my old life. I think Mr. Bradford is right, I said, my voice steady despite the sudden attention. We're treating loan applications like widgets on an assembly line, but small business owners aren't widgets. They're people who are often risking everything they have on a dream. James nodded encouragingly. Go on. A hair salon owner who wants to expand isn't just looking for capital. She's looking for someone who understands that her business is also her community gathering place, her artistic expression, and her family's future. Our algorithms can tell us if she can make the payments, but they can't tell us if she has the heart to make her business succeed. Exactly, James said, leaning forward. So how do we quantify heart? The question hung in the air, challenging and complex. I thought about my own journey, about the difference between surviving and thriving, between going through the motions and truly investing in your future. We don't quantify it, I said finally. We recognize it. We create space in our process for loan officers to tell the whole story, not just the numbers. We look for evidence of commitment, community ties, adaptability. We ask better questions. James smiled, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from him. That's the most sensible thing anyone said in this room all morning. After the meeting, James approached me at the coffee station. You have experience with small business owners. I used to do bookkeeping for several local businesses in Boston, I said, then immediately wondered why I'd mentioned my previous city. I usually kept my past vague. Boston's loss is Chicago's gain. Then, I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on the lending project. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? I hesitated. In my previous life, Richard would have made some comment about my lunch meetings, some subtle suggestion that I was overstepping or getting above myself. The automatic refusal was on my lips before I caught myself. Yes, I said, I'd like that. James chose a small bistro near the office, the kind of place where the servers knew the regulars by name and the menu changed with the seasons. We talked shop initially, diving deep into the challenges of community banking in an increasingly digital world. But gradually, the conversation became more personal. You have an interesting perspective on financial security, James observed as we shared a dessert. Most analysts think about it in terms of numbers and projections. You talk about it like it's something that can be lost and rebuilt. I chose my words carefully. I think security is more fragile than people realize, and more achievable than they imagine. Experience talking. Sometimes the best education comes from the hardest lessons. James nodded thoughtfully. I started Bradford Financial after my first company went bankrupt. Learned more about business in those 6 months of failure than I had in the previous 6 years of success. There was something refreshing about his honesty, his willingness to admit vulnerability. Richard had always presented himself as infallible, incapable of real mistakes or genuine self-reflection. Over the following weeks, James became a regular presence at Horizon Financial. The small business lending project evolved under his guidance, incorporating the human elements we'd initially overlooked. My role expanded as well. Sandra asked me to serve as the primary liaison with James's team, which meant longer hours but also access to strategic conversations I never would have been included in before. You're wasted in compliance, James told me one evening as we reviewed loan application prototypes. Have you ever considered moving into investment analysis? I don't have the background for that. I said automatically, you have the mind for it. Background can be learned. The idea intrigued me more than I wanted to admit. Compliance was safe, predictable, well-defined. Investment analysis was dynamic, challenging, potentially lucrative. It was also the kind of career that required confidence and ambition qualities I was still rediscovering. Bradford Financial is always looking for talent, James continued, especially people who understand both the analytical and human sides of finance. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity to consider what you want your career to look like in 5 years. That night, I sat in my small apartment, looking out at the Chicago skyline, thinking about futures and possibilities. A year ago, I'd been balancing checkbooks for corner stores and beauty salons, married to a man who saw my work as a hobby rather than a profession. Now I was discussing investment strategies with one of the most successful financial consultants in the region. The transformation wasn't just professional. I'd lost 15 pounds without trying, the stress weight that had accumulated during the final years of my marriage melting away as my confidence returned. My hair was longer, my clothes more polished, my posture straighter. I looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms and strategy sessions. More importantly, I felt like that person. The decision to leave Horizon Financial wasn't easy. Sandra had been a wonderful mentor, and I built genuine friendships with my colleagues, but James's offer was too compelling to ignore senior investment analyst at Bradford Financial Group. With a salary that doubled my current income and opportunities for advancement that didn't exist in the credit union's smaller structure. I'm proud of you, Sandra said when I gave my notice. And I'm not surprised. You have a gift for seeing the big picture while managing the details. That's rare in this industry. My last day at Horizon was bittersweet. Linda threw a small party in the conference room, complete with cake and speeches about my contributions to the lending project. Several colleagues asked me to stay in touch, invitations that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. You're going to do great things at Bradford Financial, Emily said as she walked me to my car. James doesn't hire people unless he sees real potential. Bradford Financial Group occupied 2 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, with views of the skyline that took my breath away every morning. My office was small, but had a window, a luxury I'd never experienced before. The work was exactly as challenging as James had promised, involving complex financial modeling, risk assessment, and client relations. My first major project involved analyzing potential investments for a tech startup incubator. The company wanted to expand into fintech, funding early-stage companies that were developing new banking and payment technologies. My job was to evaluate which startups showed the most promise and recommend funding levels. Trust your instincts, James advised during our first project meeting. The numbers will tell you if a company is financially sound, but only your judgment can tell you if they're going to succeed. I spent weeks interviewing startup founders, reviewing business plans, and analyzing market trends. The work required me to think strategically about entire industries, not just individual companies. It was intellectually demanding in ways that energized rather than exhausted me. One company particularly caught my attention. Digital Vault Financial was developing a platform that would allow small banks to offer sophisticated digital services without the massive infrastructure investments typically required. The founder, Sarah Kim, was a former bank executive who understood both the technological and regulatory challenges involved. Most fintech companies are trying to disrupt traditional banking, Sarah explained during our meeting. We want to empower it, give community banks the tools they need to compete with the big players while maintaining their local relationships. Her vision aligned perfectly with everything I'd learned during the Horizon Financial Project. After extensive analysis, I recommended Digital Vault as Bradford Financial's largest investment in the incubator fund. You're betting big on this one, James observed when I presented my recommendation. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve meaningful returns, I replied, using language I'd learned from watching him work. Sounds like you're learning to think like an investor. The Digital Vault investment proved prescient. Within 6 months, 3 major community banks had signed licensing agreements, and the company's valuation had tripled. James made sure I received credit for identifying the opportunity, which led to a promotion and a significant bonus. You have a natural talent for this work, he told me during my performance review. I'd like to give you more responsibility. How do you feel about client development? Client development meant traveling, making presentations, and building relationships with high net worth individuals and institutional investors. It was a significant step up from analysis work, requiring skills I wasn't sure I possessed. I think I'd like to try, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. My first major client presentation was to the board of a family foundation that was considering diversifying their investment portfolio. I spent days preparing, rehearsing answers to every possible question, creating visual aids that would make complex financial concepts accessible to non-experts. Remember, James coached me beforehand, they're not just buying our investment strategy, they're buying our expertise, our judgment, and our commitment to their success. The presentation went smoothly until one board member asked a question I hadn't anticipated. Ms. Wilson, this is impressive work, but you're quite young. How do we know you'll still be here in 5 years to manage our investments? The question stung, but I understood the concern. In an industry where relationships often lasted decades, I was asking them to trust someone with relatively little experience. You're right that I'm newer to this industry than some of my colleagues, I said carefully. But that also means I'm building my reputation on every client relationship, every successful investment, every promise kept. I can't afford to be careless with your trust because my entire career depends on earning and maintaining it. The board approved our proposal unanimously. Well done, James said afterward. You turned a weakness into a strength. That takes confidence and quick thinking. As my client base grew, so did my income and professional reputation. I moved from my small apartment to a 2-bedroom condo with lake views, bought my first new car, and began building an investment portfolio of my own. The financial security I'd lost when Richard betrayed me was not only restored, but exceeded. More significantly, I was building something that belonged entirely to me: no joint accounts, no shared assets, no vulnerability to another person's poor decisions or moral failures. Every dollar I earned, every investment I made, every professional relationship I built was mine alone. 2 years into my tenure at Bradford Financial, James approached me with an unexpected proposition. I'm thinking about expanding the firm, he said during one of our regular strategy meetings, opening a branch office in Philadelphia, focusing on East Coast clients who want more personalized service than the big firms provide. That sounds like a natural expansion, I agreed. I want you to head it up. Full partner track, equity stake, your name on the door eventually. The offer was everything I'd never dared to dream of during my marriage to Richard: financial independence, professional recognition, the opportunity to build something significant from the ground up. It would mean relocating again, James continued. I know you've built a life here in Chicago. I looked around his office, taking in the lake views and the city I'd come to love. Chicago had been my sanctuary, the place where I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up. But it had always been a way station, not a destination. Actually, I said, I think Philadelphia sounds perfect. The decision to accept James's offer felt like the natural next step in a journey I was finally controlling. Philadelphia represented not just professional advancement, but proof that I could succeed anywhere, build meaningful relationships in any city, thrive in whatever circumstances I chose to create. Planning the Philadelphia expansion consumed months of work. I traveled to the East Coast regularly, scouting office space, meeting potential clients, and building relationships with local financial institutions. The work was demanding but exhilarating. Combining all the skills I developed over the past 3 years, James proved to be an excellent business partner, trusting my judgment while providing guidance when I needed it. Our working relationship had evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared professional goals. You've come a long way from compliance work, he observed one evening as we celebrated signing the lease for our Philadelphia office space. Sometimes I can barely remember who I was before all this, I admitted. The best part is that you did it yourself. I may have provided opportunities, but you earned every success, every promotion, every client's trust. His words meant more than he probably realized. For too many years, I defined my worth through other people's opinions and needs Richard's approval, my mother's comfort, my client's satisfaction. Building something based on my own skills and judgment felt revolutionary. The Philadelphia office opened 6 months later, occupying a full floor of a downtown building with views of the Delaware River. Bradford Financial East, as we named it, specialized in serving entrepreneurs, tech executives, and family businesses throughout the region. I hired 3 analysts and 2 client relationship managers, building a team that reflected the collaborative, personal approach that had made James's original firm successful. Our first major client was exactly the kind of relationship I'd hoped to build: Keystone Innovations, a clean energy company founded by 2 former IBM engineers who were developing next-generation battery technology. They needed sophisticated financial management as they scaled their operations and attracted institutional investors. We've worked with the big firms, explained co-founder Jennifer Walsh during our initial meeting. But they treat us like just another account. We want partners who understand our industry and our goals. That's exactly what we're here to provide, I assured her. Your success is our success. The Keystone Innovations relationship became a model for our approach. Instead of simply managing their investments, we helped them develop financial strategies that aligned with their business objectives. When they needed additional capital for expansion, we connected them with investors from our network. When they considered international partnerships, we provided market analysis and risk assessments. You've become our unofficial CFO, Jennifer joked during one of our quarterly reviews. That's the highest compliment you could give me. I replied, and meant it. By the end of our first year in Philadelphia, Bradford Financial East was managing over $50 million in client assets and had established relationships with major players throughout the East Coast business community. Industry publications began featuring my work, and I was invited to speak at conferences about community focused financial services. The professional success was deeply satisfying, but the personal growth was even more significant. I'd built a new life entirely on my own terms, surrounded by colleagues who valued my judgment and clients who trusted my expertise. The woman who had once been abandoned at a bank, humiliated and financially vulnerable, had become someone who helped others achieve their financial goals and dreams. Throughout this transformation, my relationship with James had evolved as well. What began as professional admiration had gradually deepened into something more personal. Unlike Richard, who had seen my ambitions as threatening, James celebrated my successes and challenged me to reach higher. He respected my judgment, valued my perspective, and treated me as a genuine partner in all our endeavors. When he proposed during a weekend trip to Cape May, it felt like the natural culmination of the life we'd been building together. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony overlooking the Atlantic, witnessed by our closest friends and colleagues. It was everything my first wedding wasn't: intimate, honest, and based on genuine partnership rather than romantic fantasy. To building something that matters, James toasted at our reception. Together, I added, raising my glass to meet his. Little did I know that the ultimate test of everything I'd built was about to walk through my office door, in the form of the man who had once left me stranded at a bank. I was reviewing quarterly investment reports when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Miss Wilson, there's a Richard Sullivan here to see you. He says it's about a business loan consultation." The name hit me like a physical blow. Richard Sullivan. He'd taken his middle name as his surname, probably to distance himself from the reputation damage his company had suffered in Boston. I set down my pen carefully, my hands steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "Did he mention which company he represents? Sullivan Construction Services?" My assistant consulted her notes. "He said it was regarding expansion financing, so he'd rebranded the family business along with himself." Richard had always been skilled at reinvention when it served his purposes. I wondered what desperate circumstances had driven him to Philadelphia, to my office, to asking for help from someone he'd never expected to see again. "Send him in," I said. I had 30 seconds to prepare myself, 30 seconds to transition from the successful financial executive I'd become back to the woman whose husband had once left her stranded and humiliated. But as I straightened my shoulders and smoothed my tailored jacket, I realized something profound had shifted. I wasn't that vulnerable woman anymore. I was the one holding the power now. Richard walked through my office door looking older than his 42 years. His dark hair showed streaks of premature gray, and his face carried lines that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. He'd lost weight, but not in a healthy way. His expensive suit couldn't quite hide the fact that he looked worn down, desperate. He stopped short when he saw me, his confident stride faltering for a moment. Pure shock replaced his carefully constructed businessman's mask. "Margaret." His voice cracked slightly on my name. "Mr. Sullivan," I replied coolly, not rising from my desk. "Please have a seat. I understand you're interested in discussing financing options for your construction company." Richard remained standing, staring at me as if I were an apparition. "I don't understand. What are you doing here? How are you?" "I'm the managing partner of Bradford Financial East," I said simply. "We specialize in business development loans and investment services for East Coast companies. Would you like to discuss your financing needs, or would you prefer to schedule this meeting for another time?" My professional demeanor seemed to shake him out of his stupor. Richard slowly took the chair across from my desk, his eyes never leaving my face. I could see him trying to reconcile the woman before him with the wife he'd abandoned 5 years ago. "You look different," he said quietly. "People change." I opened a new file on my computer. "Now, tell me about Sullivan Construction Services. What kind of expansion are you considering?" Richard fumbled with his briefcase, pulling out a folder of documents with hands that shook slightly. "We're looking to expand into the Philadelphia market, residential and commercial construction. We have contracts lined up, but we need capital to purchase equipment and hire additional crews." I accepted his business plan and financial statements, scanning them with the practiced eye I'd developed over the past 5 years. The numbers told a story of consistent struggle, narrow profit margins, and mounting debt. This wasn't a thriving company looking to grow. This was a failing business desperately seeking a lifeline. "Your debt-to-equity ratio is concerning," I observed, keeping my tone neutral. "And I see several outstanding judgments from suppliers and subcontractors." "Those are temporary setbacks," Richard said quickly. "The construction industry in Massachusetts has been challenging, But Philadelphia's market is booming. We just need working capital to get established here. I continued reading, noting discrepancies between projected revenues and realistic market assessments. Richard had always been optimistic about his business prospects, but these projections bordered on fantasy. Mr. Sullivan, these revenue projections seem aggressive given your company's historical performance. What makes you confident you can achieve this level of growth in a new market? Richard shifted uncomfortably. We have experience, established relationships with suppliers, a solid reputation. Do you? I pulled up a credit report on my computer screen. Because your credit rating suggests otherwise, and these supplier relationships you mention appear to have resulted in several liens against your company assets. The color drained from Richard's face as he realized I wasn't going to simply accept his optimistic presentation at face value. This wasn't a courtesy meeting with a small-town banker who might be swayed by charm and promises. This was a professional evaluation by someone who understood exactly how to dissect a business plan. Look, Margaret, he said, abandoning his formal approach. I know this is awkward, but I really need this loan. The business is sound. I just need someone to believe in it. Ms. Wilson, I corrected. And belief isn't how we evaluate loan applications. We look at cash flow, asset values, market conditions, and management competency. Richard's jaw tightened. Management competency. Your financial records show a pattern of overextending on projects, failing to collect receivables in a timely manner, and inconsistent profit margins. These suggest systemic management issues rather than temporary market challenges. I was being deliberately harsh, but not unfairly so. Everything I was saying was documented in the papers he provided. Richard had simply never had anyone with the expertise to point out these patterns so clearly. I've learned from those mistakes, he insisted. That's why I'm starting fresh in Philadelphia. Starting fresh, I repeated. Is that what you call leaving behind outstanding debts and legal obligations? Richard's face flushed red. You don't know what you're talking about. Actually, I do. I've spent the last 5 years learning exactly what I'm talking about. I closed his file and leaned back in my chair. Mr. Sullivan, based on your company's financial history and current obligations, Bradford Financial East cannot approve your loan application. You can't be serious. You haven't even looked at the contracts I have lined up. I've looked at everything I need to see. Your company represents exactly the kind of risk we don't take. Richard stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking completely. This is because of us. Isn't it you're punishing me for what happened between us? What happened between us? I asked quietly. Remind me. Don't play games, Margaret. You know what I'm talking about. I know that you systematically stole money from our joint accounts to fund an affair. I know that you left me at a bank, unable to pay for my mother's medical expenses because you'd cleaned out our savings. I know that you abandoned our marriage for another woman and left me to deal with the financial wreckage alone. Richard's anger faltered as I laid out the facts in the same calm tone I used for client presentations. That's not how it happened. That's exactly how it happened. But you're wrong about my motivation for denying your loan. I'm not punishing you for being a terrible husband. I'm protecting my client's investments by refusing to fund a business with a documented history of poor management and financial instability. So that's it. You won't even consider it. Mr. Sullivan, if you'd like a second opinion, I can refer you to other financial institutions in the area. However, I suspect you'll receive similar responses once they review your credit history and financial statements. Richard stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to process this new version of me. The wife he'd left behind had been financially dependent, professionally insecure, and emotionally vulnerable. The woman sitting across from him now controlled millions of dollars in investment capital and spoke his language better than he did. How did this happen? He asked, his voice hollow. How did you become this? I became what I always had the potential to be, I replied. I just needed to be in an environment where that potential was recognized and valued. And you couldn't have done that in Boston? In our marriage, the question hung between us, loaded with implications Richard probably hadn't intended. I considered how to answer, weighing honesty against professionalism. Our marriage was built on the assumption that I was fundamentally less capable than you, less intelligent, less ambitious, less worthy of respect and consideration. That assumption made it impossible for either of us to see who I really was. Richard sank back into his chair. I never thought you were less intelligent. You thought my work was a hobby. You made financial decisions without consulting me. You dismissed my concerns as nagging and my insights as irrelevant. Whether you consciously thought I was less intelligent or not, you certainly treated me that way. I was trying to protect you, to handle the difficult things so you didn't have to worry about them. You were trying to control me, and when control wasn't enough, you replaced me. Richard rubbed his face with both hands. Jessica and I broke up 6 months ago. I felt nothing at this revelation, no satisfaction, no vindication, no curiosity about what had gone wrong. Jessica Price was a chapter in someone else's story now. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it in the abstract way you might feel sorry for any stranger's personal difficulties. Are you married now? Richard asked suddenly. My personal life isn't relevant to this business discussion. I saw the ring. He gestured to my left hand, where a simple platinum band caught the afternoon light streaming through my office windows. James and I had married 6 months ago in a small ceremony overlooking the Atlantic. Witnessed by our closest friends and colleagues, it had been everything my first wedding wasn't: intimate, honest, and based on genuine partnership rather than romantic fantasy. Yes, I'm married, I said. To someone in finance, to someone who values my judgment and respects my capabilities. Richard winced as if I'd slapped him. Margaret, I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we had 15 years together. That has to count for something. It does count for something. It taught me exactly what I don't want in a relationship. So, you'll help other businesses, other families, but not me. I help viable businesses with sound management and realistic growth plans. Your company doesn't meet those criteria. Richard gathered his papers slowly, defeat evident in every movement. You've really changed. I've grown into who I was always meant to be. He paused at the door. Are you happy? The question surprised me with its sincerity. For a moment, Richard sounded like the man I'd once thought I'd married, rather than the stranger who had betrayed and abandoned me. Yes, I said simply. I'm happy. Good, he said, and something in his voice suggested he might actually mean it. You deserve that. After Richard left, I sat in my office watching the Philadelphia skyline as afternoon faded into evening. The encounter had been less traumatic than I'd expected, but more significant in ways I was still processing. Seeing Richard again had crystallized just how completely my life had transformed. 5 years ago, I'd been financially dependent on a man who saw me as a burden to be managed rather than a partner to be valued. Now I was financially independent, professionally respected, and personally fulfilled. The contrast was so stark it felt almost surreal. My phone buzzed with a text from James. How did the big client meeting go today? I smiled, remembering that I'd told him about an important presentation I was giving to a potential new client. I hadn't mentioned Richard's name or our history, just that I had a challenging meeting scheduled. Interesting, I texted back. Tell you about it over dinner. Can't wait. Pick up wine on your way home. Home, 6 months into our marriage. James and I had bought a house in one of Philadelphia's historic neighborhoods, a restored brownstone with enough space for both of our home offices. It was the first house I'd ever owned entirely in my own name, the first space that reflected my tastes and needs rather than someone else's preferences. That evening, I told James about Richard's visit while we cooked dinner together, a ritual we'd established early in our relationship. James listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions about the business aspects of the meeting. Sounds like you handled it perfectly, he said as we sat down to eat. Professional but firm. I kept waiting to feel angry or vindicated or something dramatic, I admitted. But mostly I just felt sorry for him. He looked so diminished. That's probably because you've moved beyond needing any particular response from him. The power dynamic has shifted completely. James was right. 5 years ago, Richard's approval or disapproval had carried enormous weight in how I saw myself. Now, his opinion was irrelevant to my sense of worth or success. The emotional hold he'd once had over me was completely broken. Do you think I was too harsh? I asked. About the loan. I mean, were your assessments accurate? Completely. His company is a terrible risk. Then you did your job. Personal history doesn't change fiduciary responsibility. This was one of the things I loved most about James. He understood the difference between emotional reactions and professional obligations, and he trusted my judgment in both arenas. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about Richard's visit less and less. It had been a significant moment, but not a defining one. I was too busy building my actual life to spend much time analyzing my former one. Bradford Financial East continued to grow. We signed 3 new major clients, including a tech startup that was developing environmental monitoring software and a family-owned shipping company that was expanding into European markets. Each new relationship reinforced my confidence in the business model James and I had developed. I also began getting recognition within the broader financial community. The East Coast Business Journal named me one of their 40 under 40 rising executives, and I was invited to join the board of a nonprofit organization that provided microloans to women entrepreneurs. You're becoming quite the local celebrity, James observed one morning as he read a profile of me in the business section of the Philadelphia Inquirer. It feels strange, I admitted. 5 years ago, I was completely invisible. Now people know my name. You were never invisible. You were just in the wrong environment to be seen. James had a gift for reframing my experiences in ways that honored my growth without dwelling on past pain. He helped me understand that my transformation wasn't about becoming someone new, but about finally having the space and support to become who I'd always been capable of being. 6 months after Richard's visit, I received an unexpected phone call from my former lawyer in Boston. Richard had filed for bankruptcy, and his creditors were pursuing collection on the court ordered repayment of the money he'd stolen from our joint accounts. He's claiming inability to pay, my lawyer explained. But I wanted you to know that we're continuing to pursue the judgment. If he ever comes into money again, you'll be entitled to collect. I thanked her for the update, but realized I no longer cared about the money Richard owed me. The amount was significant by my old standards, but negligible compared to my current income. More importantly, I moved so far beyond needing anything from Richard that even justice felt unnecessary. Let it go, I told the lawyer. I don't want to spend any more time or energy on this. Are you sure it's a substantial amount? I'm sure. Close the file. That evening, I told James about the call. I think that's the last connection I had to my old life, I said. It feels good to let it go. How do you feel about Richard losing everything? I considered the question carefully. Sad for him, I guess, but not responsible for it. He made his choices, and this is where they led. No desire for revenge, no satisfaction that he's struggling. None. His life has nothing to do with mine anymore. James smiled and pulled me close. That's how I know you're completely free of him. When someone else's success or failure doesn't affect your emotional state, you've achieved true independence. True independence. The phrase resonated deeply. For too many years, my sense of worth had been tied to other people's opinions and needs Richard's approval. My mother's comfort, my client's satisfaction. Building something based entirely on my own skills and judgment felt revolutionary. As Bradford Financial East approached its second anniversary, James and I began discussing expansion again. This time, the conversation centered on opening offices in Boston and New York, creating a regional presence that could serve entrepreneurs and growing companies throughout the Northeast. Are you ready to go back to Boston? James asked during one of our planning sessions. As a visitor, yes. As someone who belongs there, no. That's not my city anymore. It might be professionally satisfying to return as the successful executive you've become. It might be, I agreed, but I don't need that satisfaction. I know who I am now, regardless of who remembers who I used to be. The Boston office opened 18 months later, occupying a full floor of a downtown building just 6 blocks from the bank, where Richard had once left me stranded and humiliated. I didn't mention that coincidence to anyone, but I was aware of it every time I visited our new location. What I hadn't anticipated was that Bradford Financial would soon have the opportunity to acquire that very bank. First Liberty Bank had struggled in recent years, facing competition from larger institutions and digital disruptors. When their board began seeking acquisition partners, Bradford Financial was on their short list. First Liberty is looking for a buyer, James told me one evening. They're a good fit for our community banking strategy. Solid customer base, strong deposit history, just poorly managed at the executive level. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. I know that bank well. That's right. You used to live in Boston. Did you bank with them? Yes, I said simply, not elaborating on the painful history. They have a good local reputation. The acquisition process moved quickly. First, Liberty's financial situation was more precarious than they'd initially disclosed, and they needed a partner who could close the deal within months rather than years. Bradford Financial was perfectly positioned, with the capital, expertise, and agility to complete the transaction on an accelerated timeline. I recused myself from the direct negotiations due to my personal history with the bank, but I was involved in the integration planning and strategic decisions about First Liberty's future role within our growing organization. We're thinking of keeping the First Liberty name for the retail branches, James said during one of our strategy sessions. It has strong brand recognition in Boston, and customers trust it. I agree, I said, and meant it. Despite my own complicated history with the institution, First Liberty had served generations of Boston families with integrity and care. That legacy deserved preservation, even as we modernized their operations and expanded their capabilities. The day the acquisition was announced, my phone buzzed with texts and emails from former Boston acquaintances who had seen the news. Most were congratulatory. Though a few contained not so subtle digs about my rapid rise in the financial world, I responded to all with professional courtesy, neither dwelling on past connections nor ignoring them. One message stood out from the rest, a brief email from Thomas Sullivan, Richard's younger brother, Margaret. Congratulations on the first Liberty acquisition. Richard mentioned seeing you in Philadelphia. Would appreciate a chance to talk business when you're next in Boston. Sullivan Construction has some new projects that might interest Bradford Financial. Best, Thomas. I remember Thomas as more business savvy than Richard, but lacking in construction experience, apparently. He had taken over Sullivan Construction after Richard's bankruptcy, perhaps trying to salvage the family business. His approach direct, professional, without reference to our personal connection, was a welcome contrast to Richard's desperate plea for financing. I forwarded the email to our Boston team with a note suggesting they evaluate Sullivan Construction as they would any potential client, without special treatment either way. My personal history with the Sullivan family didn't need to color Bradford Financial's business decisions. 2 weeks later, during my first official visit to the newly acquired First Liberty branches, I received an unexpected request. The branch manager at the downtown location, the same location where Richard had abandoned me 5 years earlier, asked if I would meet with a potential loan client whose application had raised some flags. Normally, I wouldn't bring this to your level, she explained, but he's been a customer for decades, and his financial situation is complex. I think we need executive approval before proceeding. Of course, I said. What's the client's name? Richard Sullivan. He's a construction project manager looking to start his own consulting business. The universe, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of irony. 5 years after leaving me stranded at this very bank, Richard was back, once again seeking financial help. This time, however, he would be appealing to the bank's owner, me. Schedule the meeting for tomorrow morning, I told the manager, but don't mention my involvement. Just tell him his application is being reviewed by executive management. The next morning, I arrived at the branch early, taking a moment to walk through the lobby where my life had changed so dramatically 5 years before. The physical space was the same marble counters, same fluorescent lighting, same line of customers waiting for tellers, but everything else had transformed. Richard arrived precisely on time, dressed in a suit that had seen better days but had been carefully pressed. He looked older than when I'd seen him in Philadelphia, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture slightly stooped. The bankruptcy had clearly taken its toll. The branch manager, Susan Chen, greeted him warmly. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming in. As I mentioned, your application needs executive approval. Our regional president is here today and has agreed to review your case personally. I appreciate that, Richard said, and I could hear the desperate hope in his voice. This loan means everything to my fresh start. Susan led him to the conference room where I was waiting. My back to the door as I reviewed his loan application. I heard the door open and Susan's professional introduction. Mr. Sullivan, I'd like to introduce you to Margaret Bradford, president of First Liberty Bank and managing partner of Bradford Financial. I turned, watching as recognition dawned on Richard's face, first confusion, then shock, then a resigned understanding that seemed to age him another 5 years in an instant. We meet again, Mr. Sullivan, I said, keeping my tone professional. You own the bank now. His voice was barely audible. Bradford Financial acquired First Liberty 3 weeks ago. Please, have a seat. I've been reviewing your loan application. Richard sat heavily in the chair across from me, his eyes never leaving my face. I could see him trying to process this latest twist in our intertwined stories. Is this some kind of joke? He finally asked. Not at all. This is business. Mr. Sullivan, Susan, thank you for the introduction. I'll take it from here. After Susan left, closing the door behind her, I turned my attention to the loan application. Unlike his previous request in Philadelphia, this was modest and realistic $75,000 to start a construction consulting business specializing in project rescue for troubled developments. Richard had leveraged his extensive experience in the field, focusing on the practical knowledge he gained from both successes and failures. This is a more reasonable proposal than the one you presented in Philadelphia, I observed. Richard nodded, still looking stunned. I've learned some hard lessons after the bankruptcy. I had to start over as a project manager for Continental Builders. Working for someone else again was humbling. But it taught me what I'm actually good at: identifying problems in troubled projects and fixing them. And now you want to turn that skill into a consulting business? Yes, there's a market for it. I've already been doing it informally, helping subcontractors resolve issues with general contractors. I have 3 potential clients waiting if I can get this off the ground. I studied Richard's financial projections. Unlike his previous fantasy numbers, these were conservative and well-researched. His business plan acknowledged risks and included contingency strategies. Most importantly, it played to his actual strengths rather than his imagined ones. What collateral are you offering? I asked. Richard grimaced. Not much. My house, what's left of my equity in it, and my truck. I know it's not ideal, but it's all I have. And if the loan isn't approved, then I keep working for Continental and save until I can start smaller. But that could take years, and I'm not getting any younger. I closed the file. Considering my options, the loan wasn't a terrible risk, but it wasn't a clear approval either. In the gray area where judgment mattered more than formulas, I had almost unlimited discretion as the bank's president. Mr. Sullivan, I have one question for you, and I want an honest answer. Have you learned from your past financial mistakes, or are you simply trying a new angle? Richard looked me directly in the eye, something he'd struggled to do in Philadelphia. I destroyed everything I built because I couldn't admit when I was wrong. I lost my company, my marriage, my home, and nearly my self-respect. If that's not a learning experience, I don't know what is. There was a rawness to his admission that felt genuine, not performative regret designed to manipulate, but the hard-won insight of someone who had finally seen himself clearly. First, Liberty Bank will approve your loan, I said, with standard terms and quarterly reviews for the first 2 years. If you miss a payment or violate the covenants, the full amount becomes due immediately. Richard stared at me in disbelief. You're approving it after everything. I'm approving it because it's a reasonable business risk with acceptable terms. Your personal history with me isn't relevant to this decision, just as it wasn't relevant in Philadelphia. The difference is that this time, your proposal makes business sense. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. This is a business transaction, not a personal favor. Susan will prepare the paperwork for your signature. Richard stood, still looking somewhat shell-shocked. Thank you, Margaret. I won't disappoint you. This isn't about me, Mr. Sullivan. This is about you building something sustainable based on your actual capabilities rather than your fantasies. Whether you succeed or fail won't affect my life in the slightest. He nodded slowly, understanding the fundamental shift that had occurred between us. I was no longer the wife who needed his approval or the woman he had wounded. I was simply a financial executive making a business decision. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. You deserved better. Yes, I did, and I found it. Good luck with your consulting business, Mr. Sullivan. After Richard left, I stood at the conference room window, looking out at the Boston skyline. The city that had once been my home now felt like a place I was visiting, familiar, but no longer essential to my identity. I had moved beyond needing Boston's validation, just as I had moved beyond needing Richard's. Susan returned with the approved loan documents. That was unexpected, she said. From his credit history, I thought you might decline. Sometimes people surprise you, I replied, and sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. That evening, I called James from my hotel room, sharing the strange symmetry of approving Richard's loan in the very bank where he had once abandoned me. Full circle, James observed. How does it feel? Clarifying, I said after a moment's reflection. Like closing a book I finished reading, the story's complete, and now I can put it on the shelf. No regrets about approving the loan. None. It was the right business decision, regardless of our history. And there's something satisfying about being able to make that call without emotion clouding my judgment. That's because you've built yourself into someone who can't be diminished by your past. You've transcended it. Transcendence, that's exactly what it felt like, not erasing or forgetting the pain of betrayal, but rising above it to a place where it no longer defined me. The final piece of this strange circle came 3 months later, during the grand reopening celebration for all First Liberty branches under Bradford Financial's ownership. We'd invited community leaders, longtime customers, and local business owners to a reception at the downtown branch, showcasing the improvements we'd made while emphasizing our commitment to maintaining the bank's community focus. I was making the rounds, greeting guests and thanking staff, when I spotted Richard near the refreshment table, deep in conversation with Thomas and another man I didn't recognize. He looked better than when I'd last seen him, still older than his years, but standing straighter, his expression less haunted, as our eyes met across the room. He nodded politely and raised his glass in a subtle toast. I nodded back, acknowledging the gesture without feeling any need to approach or engage further. We had said what needed to be said, and anything more would be superfluous. Later, as the event was winding down, Thomas approached me. Congratulations on the acquisition, Margaret. First Liberty looks good under Bradford Financial's banner. Thank you, Thomas. How's Sullivan Construction? Growing steadily. We've specialized in historical renovations, found our niche there. Bradford Financial's Boston office has been helpful with our expansion financing. I'm glad to hear it. Our team speaks highly of your company's management. Thomas glanced toward Richard, who was saying his goodbyes to other guests. He's doing better. You know, the consulting business is taking off. Turns out he's actually brilliant at identifying problems in troubled projects, probably because he created so many of them himself. I laughed, surprised by Thomas's candor. Sometimes our greatest expertise comes from our biggest mistakes. Exactly. Listen, I know things were difficult between you two, but I wanted to thank you for giving him a chance with that loan. It gave him back his self-respect, which is something he's been missing for a long time. It was a sound business decision. His proposal made sense. Thomas smiled knowingly. Of course it was. But we both know you could have declined it without anyone questioning your judgment. The fact that you didn't says something about who you are. As Thomas walked away, I considered his words. Had approving Richard's loan been an act of mercy, perhaps? But it had also been an assertion of my own power, the power to make decisions based on facts rather than feelings, to transcend personal history in service of professional integrity. The woman who had stood abandoned in this bank 5 years ago could never have made that choice. She had been too wounded, too defined by her relationship to Richard, too uncertain of her own value. The woman I had become, Margaret Bradford, bank president and managing partner, had the confidence to approve a loan to her ex-husband without either vindictiveness or sentimentality clouding her judgment. That evolution, more than any professional title or financial success, was the true measure of how far I had come. As the last guests departed and staff began cleaning up, I found myself alone in the bank lobby, standing in almost the exact spot where Richard had left me 5 years before. The memory no longer carried pain, only a sense of distance, like looking at a photograph of someone I used to know. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "How was the event? Perfect," I replied. "Everything has come full circle. Coming home tomorrow." Yes, I'm ready to come home. And I was ready to return to the life I had built, the partnership I had chosen, the future I was creating on my own terms. Boston would always be part of my story. But it was the prologue, not the main narrative. As I walked out of First Liberty Bank, my bank, into the cool Boston evening, I felt the satisfying click of a journey completed. 5 years after being left stranded, humiliated, and financially vulnerable, I had returned as the owner, transformed not just professionally but fundamentally. The woman who had once feared she couldn't survive without her husband now owned the very institution where he had abandoned her. Not because she had sought revenge or validation, but because she had discovered her true value and built something meaningful with it. That was the greatest victory of all, not owning a bank, but owning myself